For 30 years, Eleanor believed her home was her sanctuary, the polished floors, the sunlight through the windows, the life she built with unwavering devotion. But in a single afternoon, everything she knew shattered. The man she trusted slid a cold envelope across the table, and with it erased her entire existence. Thrown out with nothing but a suitcase and the echo of a life stolen, she thought she had reached the end of her story. Yet in the quiet of a cheap motel room, a hidden key from her mother's past emerged, a key that would unravel a secret buried for decades. What Eleanor was about to discover wouldn't just expose a betrayal. It would ignite a battle that could destroy an empire built on lies. For 30 years, the afternoon sun had always fallen the same way through the bay window, casting long, warm stripes across the gleaming hardwood floors. For Eleanor, that light wasn't just a measure of time. It was a symbol of the life she had so carefully, so lovingly built. Every polished surface, every perfectly plumped cushion, every vase of fresh-cut flowers was a testament to a quiet promise she had made to herself and her husband, Richard, on their wedding day. This home was her masterpiece, the physical manifestation of her devotion. She believed, with a deep and unwavering loyalty that had become the very core of her being, that her entire worth was contained within these four walls. She was about to discover how fragile those walls truly were. She was in her late 50s, a woman whose resilience had been forged not in grand battles, but in the quiet compromises of a long marriage. Her hands, though elegant, bore the faint calluses of a life spent tending to a home and a family. Just now, she was meticulously arranging a centerpiece of lilies on the dining table. Their white petals a stark contrast to the dark mahogany. The scent of lemon polish and fresh blooms filled the air, a fragrance she associated with peace and order. She heard the front door open and close, the familiar sound of Richard's briefcase hitting the floor. A smile touched her lips. He was home early. Perhaps he remembered their anniversary was next week. He walked into the dining room, but the man who stood before her was a stranger. His usual tired but warm expression was gone, replaced by a mask of unreadable indifference. He didn't comment on the flowers or the immaculate shine of the table. Instead, he walked directly to her and placed a thick manila envelope on the polished wood, pushing aside the vase so forcefully that water sloshed onto the surface. Eleanor's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "Richard, what's this?" she asked, her voice soft. She still clung to the hope of a surprise, maybe deeds to a vacation home or plans for a trip. "Open it," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. Inside, there was no travel brochure, no celebratory deed. There was only a stack of cold, heavy paper stapled together, with bold, unforgiving letters at the top. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The words swam before her eyes. It didn't make sense. It was like reading a language she had never seen before. She looked up at him, her heart beginning a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. I don't understand." "It's over, Eleanor," he said, his tone as sterile as the legal document in her hands. "Our marriage is finished. I found someone else." The words were like stones, each one hitting her with a brutal physical force. Someone else. The two words echoed in the sudden, cavernous silence of the room. He went on, his voice a relentless drone of destruction. "She's younger, ambitious. We're partners in business and in life now. The life you know, it has ended." He slid a pen across the table. It came to a stop just beside her trembling hand. "The papers are all there. I've been more than generous. Generous." She forced her eyes back to the document, scanning the lines of text that spelled out the end of her world. A one-time payment, a number that was a cruel joke, a tiny fraction of the immense fortune they had built together over 3 decades. His vast business empire, his portfolio of stocks, the sheer weight of his wealth, all of it had been their shared dream, or so she had believed. Now he was offering her crumbs from the table she had set for 30 years. "This," she stammered, "this is nothing. This doesn't account for the assets. The beauty's investments, so it's what you're getting." He cut in, his voice hardening. "It's a clean break. In exchange for your signature, you agree to walk away quietly. No fuss, no lawyers fighting over every last dollar." He leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, a gesture of finality. "And you have 24 hours. I want you to sign those papers and be out of this house by tomorrow afternoon." The shock was no longer just an emotion, it was a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs. 24 hours, to erase 30 years, to vacate the only home she had ever known as a wife, as a mother. The life she had so carefully curated, the identity she had so completely embraced, was imploding in a single, cruel, calculated moment. The sunlight streaming through the window suddenly felt cold, illuminating not a home, but the wreckage of a life built on a lie. The next 24 hours passed in a blur of surreal, silent horror. Eleanor moved through the rooms of her home like a ghost, her feet making no sound on the floors she had polished for decades. Every object she touched screamed with memory. The armchair where Richard used to read the paper, the small chip on the rim of her favorite teacup, the framed photos of their children on the mantelpiece, all of it belonged to a life that had been declared dead. She packed a single suitcase. What do you take from 30 years? A few changes of clothes, her mother's jewelry box, and a handful of photo albums. Everything else, the physical proof of her existence, had to be left behind. When the time came, she walked out the front door without a word, not even looking back. The click of the lock behind her was the sound of a final, brutal amputation. With nowhere else to go, she drove the few blocks to the home of Brenda, a neighbor she had known for 15 years. They had shared countless cups of coffee, celebrated holidays, and supported each other through life's smaller crises. Brenda opened the door with a look of practiced sympathy, pulling Eleanor into a hug that felt both comforting and strangely hollow. "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed, guiding Eleanor inside. "I can't believe he would do this, that monster." Eleanor, numb and exhausted, allowed herself to be led to the sofa. For a moment, the simple act of kindness felt like a lifeline in a raging sea. She broke down, the tears she had held back finally streaming down her face as she recounted the cold, clinical execution of her marriage. Brenda listened, patting her hand and murmuring reassurances. But as Eleanor's sobs subsided, the questions began. They were subtle at first, cloaked in concern. "What are you going to do for money, dear? Did he at least leave you with enough to get by?" Eleanor, in her vulnerable state, confessed the paltry sum Richard had offered. Brenda's eyes widened slightly. "And lawyers, you must get a good lawyer, someone who can fight for your share of his entire fortune." Each question was a gentle probe, extracting details about Eleanor's financial situation, her lack of a plan, her utter desperation. Eleanor didn't notice the way Brenda's gaze sharpened, the way her sympathy seemed to cool ever so slightly with each piece of information. She didn't know that as soon as she was asleep in the guest room, Brenda would be on the phone with Richard, reporting every word, confirming that his plan was working perfectly. He was ensuring his wife remained isolated, terrified, and without resources. Meanwhile, across town, Richard was celebrating. He and his new partner, a woman named Victoria whose ambition was as sharp and cold as cut glass, sat in a high-end restaurant, clinking champagne flutes. "She's out," Richard said, a smirk playing on his lips, signed the papers and left without a fight. Brenda confirmed she's a wreck. Victoria smiled, a predator's smile. "Good, now we can move forward without distractions." The lawyers have already started liquidating some of the non-essential assets. We need to move the capital into the new offshore funds before anyone gets a chance to freeze them. Their conversation was a flurry of financial terms, investments, stocks, net worth, that once represented a shared future for Eleanor, but were now just weapons being used against her. They were dismantling the empire she had helped build brick by brick, ensuring that by the time the dust settled, there would be nothing left for her to claim. Their new life was being built directly on the ruins of her old one, and they felt not a shred of guilt. Eleanor's first few days of freedom were a masterclass in humiliation. She called a dozen law firms. The ones she could afford took one look at her case, heard Richard's name and the name of his powerful legal team, and politely declined. They told her she needed a substantial retainer, a sum of money she simply didn't have. Without clear proof of hidden assets, Mrs. Harding, one lawyer told her over the phone, his voice dripping with pity, "You're looking at a long, expensive, and likely fruitless battle." The message was clear. In this world, justice had a price tag, and she couldn't afford it. Brenda's hospitality quickly soured, her home beginning to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a cage. After a few days of subtle hints about needing her space back, Eleanor knew she had to leave. She used a portion of her meager settlement to check into a cheap motel on the edge of town, the kind with stained carpets and the lingering smell of disinfectant. The gnawing feeling of invisibility began to set in. In her beautiful suburban home, she was Mrs. Harding. Here, in this anonymous room, she was no one, a ghost haunting the edges of a life she no longer recognized. Each night, as she lay on the lumpy mattress, she grieved not just for her lost marriage, but for the woman she used to be. A woman who had believed in loyalty, in partnership, and in the false security of a life built on a foundation of lies. She was completely and utterly alone, and her suffering felt infinite. One evening, in the suffocating silence of the motel room, she decided she couldn't stare at the water-stained ceiling any longer. There was one last cardboard box sitting in the corner, a box she had avoided opening. It held the few sentimental items she'd managed to grab, the things that were truly hers, untainted by Richard's influence. With a sigh that felt like it carried the weight of her entire life, she slid the box into the middle of the room and sat on the floor, pulling open the flaps. Inside were her college yearbooks, a bundle of letters from her parents, and nestled at the bottom, an old, dusty recipe box. It had belonged to her mother, a heavy wooden thing with faded, hand-painted roses on the lid. She ran her fingers over the familiar worn wood. Her mother had been a woman of quiet strength and immense caution, someone who believed in preparing for rainy days that might never come. Opening the lid released the faint scent of cinnamon and vanilla, a ghost of 1,000 happy memories from her mother's kitchen. Eleanor thumbed through the familiar, stained recipe cards, her mother's elegant cursive detailing instructions for everything from apple pie to pot roast. It was a painful reminder of a simpler, safer time. As her fingers brushed against the last card, they hit something solid. The bottom of the box seemed wrong. It was too thick. A flicker of curiosity, the first real emotion besides grief she had felt in weeks, stirred within her. She pushed the cards aside and pressed down on the wooden base. A section of it clicked and lifted, revealing a shallow, hidden compartment. Her breath caught in her throat. Lying on a bed of faded velvet was a small, ornate brass key and a single, folded photograph. She picked up the photo with trembling hands and unfolded it. It was her mother, younger, smiling. Standing proudly on a city sidewalk, behind her, carved in stone above a grand entrance, was the name of a downtown bank, one she hadn't thought about in years. She had no memory of the picture, no idea why her mother would have hidden it. But looking at her mother's confident smile, at the tangible proof of a life lived before and outside of her own turmoil, a tiny, forgotten seed of hope began to sprout in the barren landscape of her heart. That small discovery was a spark in the darkness. It didn't solve her problems, but it reminded her that she came from a line of resilient women. It was time to stop grieving the woman she was and start building a new one. She thought about her skills, the parts of herself Richard had always belittled. He had called her passion for restoring old furniture a silly hobby, a quaint way to pass the time, but she was good at it. She could see the beauty hidden beneath layers of old paint and neglect, and she knew how to bring it back to life. It was a metaphor she couldn't ignore. With the last of her cash, she bought a rickety old nightstand from a thrift store and a few cans of paint and varnish. The work was hard, her hands ached, and the smell of chemicals filled her small motel room. But as she sanded away the old, chipped paint and carefully applied a new coat of deep blue, she felt something she hadn't felt in months, a sense of purpose. The focus required was a balm for her racing mind. For hours at a time, there was only the wood, the brush, and her own 2 hands. The following weekend, she rented a small stall at a local flea market. She displayed the beautifully restored nightstand alongside a small, reupholstered footstool she'd also finished. The income was meager, barely enough to cover the stall fee and another week at the motel. But the conversations with strangers, the compliments on her work, the simple act of creating something of value from something discarded, it was therapeutic. It was a lifeline. It was during her 3rd week at the market, while carefully polishing a small wooden chest, that a man stopped at her stall. He looked vaguely familiar, a man in his early 60s with kind eyes and a thoughtful expression. Eleanor Prescott, is that you?" he asked. Using her maiden name, she looked up, startled. It took her a moment to place him. It was Mark, an old acquaintance from a college literature class, someone she hadn't seen in nearly 40 years. They made small talk, catching up on the decades that had passed. He told her he was a lawyer, now semi-retired, but he'd spent the last 20 years of his career as a forensic accountant. He specialized in finding money people tried to hide. The words hung in the air between them. Seeing the exhaustion and sadness in her eyes, he gently asked what she was doing selling furniture at a flea market. Hesitantly at first, then with a rush of pent-up frustration and grief, Eleanor told him everything. She told him about Richard, the new woman, the poultry settlement, and the high-powered lawyers who had shut her down. Mark listened intently, his expression growing more serious with every word. He was intrigued by the sheer aggression of Richard's tactics, the speed with which he was trying to erase her financially. "This isn't just a divorce, Eleanor," he said, his voice firm. "This is a financial execution, and men who move this fast are usually hiding something big." He looked at the small, restored chest she was selling. "You have a talent for seeing the value in things others have thrown away," he said. "Let me do the same for you." He offered to take her case pro bono for a percentage of whatever they could recover. For the first time since Richard had placed that envelope on her dining room table, Eleanor felt she wasn't entirely alone. The legal battle reignited, but this time Eleanor had a fighter in her corner. Mark was tenacious, filing motions and requests that Richard's legal team could no longer simply ignore. The pressure mounted. Richard and Victoria, sensing a shift in the power dynamic, retaliated. Their lawyers filed an emergency motion, a devastating strategic blow. They claimed that Richard's primary company was on the verge of bankruptcy, that a series of bad investments and a volatile market had wiped out a significant portion of his net worth. It was a lie crafted with the precision of a surgeon and the malice of a cornered snake. The documents Mark read to her over the phone were filled with complex financial jargon, detailing catastrophic losses in foreign stocks, a disastrous venture into cryptocurrency, and a portfolio of assets that had supposedly evaporated overnight. The news landed like a death sentence. Eleanor sat on the edge of her lumpy motel bed, the receiver cold against her ear, and felt the floor drop out from under her for the second time. All the fight, all the nascent strength she had gathered over the past few weeks crumbled into dust. Richard was going to win. He was going to burn his entire empire to the ground on paper, just to ensure she was left with nothing but ashes. "It's a strategic lie, Eleanor." Mark's voice was grim but steady. A very common, very dirty tactic. He's devaluing his entire and patrimonio liquido in the eyes of the court. If we can't prove he's hiding the capital, a judge might just believe him. They'll see you as the unreasonable one, fighting for a piece of a pie that no longer exists. After she hung up, a profound and heavy silence filled the room. Her gaze fell upon a half-restored rocking chair in the corner, its wood grain smooth and waiting, her silly hobby. How could she have ever thought that sanding down old wood could prepare her to fight a man who could command armies of lawyers, a man who could make a fortune disappear with a few strokes of a pen? The hope she'd felt at the flea market now seemed like a childish delusion. She was outmatched, outmaneuvered, and utterly exhausted. She considered calling Mark back, telling him to stop, to let it go. Maybe it was better to just accept the crumbs and try to build a life from what little she had left. As she sank into that familiar abyss of despair, her eyes drifted to the one object in the room that felt truly hers, her mother's old recipe box, sitting on the nightstand. She stared at it, her mind numb, until a thought, faint as a whisper, broke through the noise of her defeat. The false bottom, the key, the photograph. It was nothing. It was a sentimental relic from a bygone era, meaningless in a world of offshore funds and digital Bitcoin wallets. It was a ridiculous, flimsy hope, but in that moment, it was the only one she had. With a surge of adrenaline born of sheer desperation, she picked up the phone and called Mark again. Her voice trembled as she spoke, feeling foolish as the words came out. "Mark, I have something. It's probably nothing, but my mother, she left something behind. A small brass key and a photo of her standing in front of the old Merchants Trust Bank downtown." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Eleanor held her breath, expecting him to dismiss it as the ramblings of a desperate woman. But Mark, a man who had built a career on finding needles in financial haystacks, knew that the most important clues were often personal, not professional. "Tell me everything about it, Eleanor. Don't leave out a single detail." And so she did. She described the worn photograph, the ornate key, and the hidden compartment in the recipe box. Mark didn't laugh. He listened. The next day, he started digging. The Merchants Trust Bank had been absorbed by a national conglomerate 2 decades ago, but Mark was relentless. He navigated automated phone systems and corporate bureaucracy with a patience Eleanor could only marvel at. He explained that old bank records, especially concerning safe deposit boxes, were often meticulously preserved. For 2 days, they hit nothing but dead ends. Eleanor's fragile hope began to wane. Then, late on the 3rd afternoon, Mark called. His voice was different. It held a charge, a spark of discovery. "I found it," he said, and Eleanor felt her heart leap into her throat. "The key you have opens safe deposit box number 713 at the main branch on Grand Avenue, and the box is still active. It's registered under the name Evelyn Prescott, her mother's maiden name." A wave of memories, sharp and painful, washed over Eleanor. She suddenly remembered a conversation years ago, shortly after her father had passed. Her mother, a woman who trusted hard work over the whims of the Bolsa de Valores, had been talking about securing her future and Eleanor's. "You can't trust everything to paper and investments and promises, Ellie," she had said, her voice firm. "You always need a foundation, a piece of solid ground no one can take away." Her mother had mentioned the box then, a final emergency measure, a tesoro, just for her. But in the haze of grief that followed her mother's death a few years later, the memory had been buried. a forgotten detail in the painful process of settling a life's affairs. "Oh, Mark," she whispered, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I remember. I completely forgot. Grief does that," he said gently. "It hides things from us to protect us, but you remembered when you needed it most. Now, the question is, what did your mother consider a piece of solid ground?" The possibilities raced through Eleanor's mind. Old savings bonds, a stash of dollars, her mother's jewelry, whatever it was, it felt like a message from the past, a final gift from a woman whose love was proving to be more resilient than any financial empire. They made an appointment to visit the bank the following morning. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt not just the hope of survival, but the electrifying possibility of justice. The next morning, Eleanor stood before the towering marble columns of the bank, a building that seemed to belong to another era. It was a fortress of wealth and secrets, cold and imposing. Beside her, Mark offered a reassuring smile, but Eleanor's hands were clammy, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of old paper and money. They were led by a stern-faced bank employee into a hushed, carpeted room, and then down a short flight of stairs into the vault. The massive circular steel door, with its intricate web of locking mechanisms, swung open with a heavy, satisfying thud. The employee, using both her key and Eleanor's small brass one, retrieved a long, slender metal box and placed it on a polished wooden table in a private viewing room. Then she left, closing the door softly behind her. For a moment, neither Eleanor nor Mark moved. The box, number 714, sat between them, a silent testament to her mother's foresight. It was a time capsule, a final message sent across the years. "Ready?" Mark asked gently. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. He lifted the lid. Her mind had raced with possibilities. Old stock certificates, a deed to a forgotten piece of property, a hidden stash of gold or foreign currency like euros. But the box contained none of that. There was no immediate, tangible wealth. Instead, it was filled with something far more profound. On top lay a stack of leather-bound journals, tied together with a faded silk ribbon. Beneath them was a single, thick, leather-bound business ledger, its cover embossed with the name of a small accounting firm that had gone out of business decades ago. Eleanor felt a pang of disappointment. It was just paper, old memories and forgotten numbers. Mark, however, leaned forward, his eyes alight with the thrill of the hunt. He recognized these for what they were, not relics, but weapons. He carefully untied the ribbon on the journals and opened the first one. It was her mother's handwriting, neat and precise. But as Eleanor began to read over his shoulder, she saw it wasn't a diary of daily life. It was a log of suspicions, a chronicle of a mother's quiet, growing unease about the man her daughter had married. But it was the ledger that held the true bombshell. Mark opened it to the first page. There, in meticulous handwritten entries, was a detailed accounting of her mother's herança from her own father, and on the following pages, a clear, undeniable record of that entire sum, every last dollar, being transferred not into a trust for Eleanor, but directly to a new corporate entity. The name of that entity was Harding Enterprises, the seed money. The entire foundation of Richard's vast business empire, the source of his entire fortune, had not come from a brilliant early investment or a stroke of genius. It had come from her mother's money, a sum he had told her, with a pained expression just a year after their wedding, had been tragically lost in a stock market crash. He hadn't lost it. He had stolen it. He had built his entire kingdom on a bedrock of her family's legacy, and then had the audacity to call her a silly hobbyist who didn't understand negocios. The breath left her body in a ragged gasp. All the years of scrimping and saving in the beginning, of her believing they were building something together from nothing, It was all a lie. She had been a partner in a fantasy, while he had been the sole beneficiary of a crime. As they turned the pages of the ledger and the journals, the full, horrifying scope of his 30-year deception unfurled. Her mother's journals detailed conversations where Richard had been evasive about his new company's initial lucro. She wrote about her gut feeling that he was too slick, too charming, too focused on the accumulation of Benzes and status. Tucked inside the last journal was a folded, yellowed letter. It was a draft, written by her mother to a lawyer, detailing a phone call she had overheard. It described Richard talking to an employee with whom he was having an affair years ago, promising her a promotion and a significant raise to keep quiet about his initial financial fraud. It established a sinister pattern of deceit that went far beyond simple infidelity. He wasn't just a cheater, he was a predator who had been manipulating and stealing from her and her family from the very beginning. The bankruptcy claim, the aggressive lawyers, kicking her out of her home. It wasn't just cruelty, it was the desperate act of a man terrified that this very box, this very ledger, would one day be opened. The sterile quiet of the viewing room seemed to roar in Eleanor's ears. The man she had loved, the father of her children, the life she had mourned, had never truly existed. He was a phantom, a carefully constructed illusion, and she had been his greatest, most enduring trick. Mark let out a low whistle, his professional excitement cutting through Eleanor's suffocating grief. "This is it, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low, intense hum. "This isn't just a smoking gun. This is the whole armory." He didn't just hide marital assets. He built his entire fortune on stolen capital. "This ledger is a roadmap to every dollar of your mother's inheritance, sir." But Eleanor could barely hear him. She was staring at the ledger, at the cold, hard numbers that represented a 30-year lie. The pain was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. The betrayal was so absolute, so foundational, it retroactively poisoned every memory she held dear. Every anniversary dinner, every shared smile, every word of encouragement he had ever given her was now tainted, part of an elaborate performance designed to keep her placid and unsuspecting while he managed her stolen inheritance. As they packed the contents of the box, Mark's mind was already formulating a legal strategy. Eleanor's was trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the monster revealed in her mother's journals. The fight was no longer just about getting a fair settlement. It was about reclaiming a stolen legacy and honoring the memory of the woman who had tried, even from beyond the grave, to protect her. But Richard and Victoria were not going to wait passively to be exposed. They sensed the shift in the battle. Mark's new, aggressive legal filings were no longer the work of an overwhelmed, underfunded lawyer. They were precise, targeted, and dangerously close to the truth. Richard, a man who had controlled every aspect of his life and business with ruthless efficiency, felt that control slipping, and he reacted like a cornered animal. The harassment started subtly. A private investigator began parking across the street from Eleanor's motel, his presence a constant, unnerving reminder that she was being watched. Her phone would ring at odd hours, with only silence on the other end when she answered. Then, the legal attacks intensified. Richard's lawyers filed a barrage of frivolous motions designed to bleed her dry, forcing Mark to spend countless unpaid hours responding. They accused her of harassment, of emotional instability, of being a gold digger trying to extort a successful businessman on the verge of financial collapse. Each accusation was a twisted inversion of the truth, a psychological blow designed to break her spirit. Victoria was the architect of this campaign. She saw Eleanor not as a person, but as a liability, a loose end that needed to be tied up before it could unravel their plans for a future as a billionario power couple. "We need to push her until she breaks," she told Richard one night, her voice cold as ice. "Make her feel so alone, so exhausted, that she'll take any offer just to make it stop. People like her don't have the stomach for a real fight. They nearly succeeded. The constant pressure was a corrosive acid, eating away at Eleanor's newfound resolve. The small income from her furniture restoration was not enough to live on, and the legal battle, even with Mark working pro bono, had hidden costs. She felt herself slipping back into that dark place of despair, the feeling of invisibility returning with a vengeance. She was just one woman, with a box of old papers, against a man who could manipulate the stock market, hide millions in offshore San fundos, and command an army of lawyers to bend the truth to his will. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, after receiving another threatening letter from Richard's legal team, this one hinting at suing her for defamation, Eleanor hit her breaking point. She called Mark, her voice thick with tears and defeat. "I can't do this anymore, Mark. I can't. He's going to destroy me. Let's just let it go. I'll take whatever he's offering. I just want it to be over." Mark listened patiently, letting her pour out her fear and exhaustion. When she was finished, there was a long pause. "I know you're tired, Eleanor," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "That's what they want. They are trying to exhaust you emotionally and financially. But we are closer than ever. Don't let them win now. Come to my office. Let's go over everything one more time. Let's look at your mother's journals again. Let's remember why we're doing this." Reluctantly, she agreed. That evening, they sat in Mark's cluttered office, the rain beating against the window pane. The ledger and journals were spread out on the desk between them. As Eleanor picked up one of her mother's journals, feeling the worn leather, a small, hard object slipped from a pocket sewn into the inside cover and clattered onto the desk. It was a tiny, old-fashioned micro-cassette recorder, the kind journalists used in the 80s. It was a forgotten piece of technology, an analog ghost in a digital world. Eleanor stared at it, confused. I don't remember seeing this before." Mark picked it up, his eyes wide with a dawning realization. "My God, Eleanor, your mother! She wasn't just suspicious. She was gathering evidence." A surge of adrenaline shot through Eleanor, chasing away the exhaustion. They looked at each other, the same thought flashing in their eyes. The ledger was proof of the crime. The journals were proof of the pattern. But a recording could be proof of the confession. Now all they had to do was find a machine that could play it. It turned out to be harder than they expected. Finding a working micro-cassette player in an age of smartphones and cloud storage was like searching for a fossil. Mark called old electronics repair shops and scoured online auction sites. For 2 agonizing days, it seemed the crucial piece of evidence would remain silent, a locked secret on a tiny magnetic tape. Finally, an old court reporter, a friend of Mark's, had one stored in a box in his garage. He dusted it off, put in fresh batteries, and when Mark pressed play, the small machine whirred to life. The final confrontation was set not in a grand courtroom, but in the sterile, oppressive atmosphere of a deposition meeting held in a high-rise law office overlooking the city. Richard and Victoria arrived looking every bit the power couple, dressed in expensive, tailored suits. They were confident, almost bored, their lawyers flanking them with smug expressions. They believed they had Eleanor completely cornered. Their bankruptcy claim had been a masterstroke, leaving her with no apparent leverage, a desperate woman clinging to the wreckage of a failed marriage. They saw this meeting as a final formality, a chance to swat away her last pathetic attempts at a fight before finalizing their victory. Eleanor walked in beside Mark, and the woman who entered the room was not the one they had thrown away. The timid, broken wife was gone. In her place stood a woman forged in the fires of betrayal and loss. She was calm, her posture straight, her eyes clear and steady. She had spent the morning in her small workshop, the familiar scent of sawdust and varnish grounding her, reminding her of the strength she had found in her own 2 hands. She was no longer just Richard Harding's ex-wife. She was Eleanor Prescott, restorer of forgotten things, and she was there to reclaim what had been stolen. The meeting began with Richard's lead attorney droning on about their client's unfortunate financial downturn and their generous, final offer, a pittance that was even less than the original amount. Eleanor listened without expression. When he finished, Mark simply slid the heavy leather ledger across the vast, polished table. "We can start by discussing this," he said, his voice even. Richard's lawyer picked it up, flipped through a few pages and scoffed. "And what is this supposed to be? Some kind of homemade accounting book? This is inadmissible. A fabrication." Richard smirked, leaning back in his chair. He had expected something desperate, and this was it. "Then perhaps you'll find these more compelling," Mark continued, placing her mother's journals next to the ledger. The personal diaries of Evelyn Prescott, detailing her suspicions about where her answer truly went. One of the younger lawyers on Richard's team objected loudly, citing hearsay and privacy violations. The room filled with legal posturing, a cloud of jargon designed to obscure the truth. Richard and Victoria exchanged a look of amusement. This was all just noise. They had the real power, the real money, safely hidden away where no dusty old diary could ever find it. Then, Mark placed the small, grey microcassette recorder in the center of the table. It looked absurdly out of place, a relic from a forgotten time sitting amidst the sleek laptops and designer pens. "And finally," Mark said, his voice cutting through the objections, "we have this." A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard stared at the small machine, a flicker of something, unease, a distant memory, in his eyes. Victoria frowned, not understanding its significance. "This was also found in Mrs. Prescott's safe deposit box," Mark explained. "She was, as you know, a very prudent woman." He pressed the play button. A soft hiss filled the room, followed by the crackle of old tape. Then, a voice emerged from the tiny speaker, a younger, more confident voice, a voice Eleanor hadn't heard in 30 years. It was Richard, and he was speaking to her mother. "I know it was your entire inheritance, Evelyn," the recorded voice said, tinny and ghostly. "But think of it as an investment. I'm not just borrowing it. This capital is the foundation. I swear to you, I will pay it all back with substantial interest. This negotio is going to generate a fortuna, and Eleanor will be set for life." The color drained from Richard's face. The smug confidence vanished, replaced by a ghastly, pale shock. He looked as if he had seen a ghost, and in a way, he had. The ghost of a promise he had made and buried 3 decades ago. Victoria stared at him, her perfectly made-up face a mask of dawning horror. The man she had aligned herself with, the brilliant multimillionario whose empire she was set to inherit, was nothing more than a common thief who had stolen his seed money from his mother-in-law. The entire foundation of her new life, of the riqueza she had coveted, was crumbling before her very eyes. The crackling, tinny sound of his own confession filled the silent room. The irrefutable proof of his deception, of the original sin upon which his entire empire was built, hung in the air, a ghost from the past that had finally returned to claim its justice. The silence that followed the recording was heavier than any sound. It was a vacuum, pulling all the air, all the bluster, and all the lies out of the room. Richard's lead attorney, a man who had been the picture of condescending authority just moments before, now stared at the small plastic recorder as if it were a venomous snake. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. No pre-written objection or legal maneuver capable of undoing what they had all just heard. Victoria was the first to move. She slowly pushed her chair back from the table, the sound scraping loudly in the stillness. She looked at Richard, not with sympathy or support, but with the cold, appraising glare of an investor cutting their losses on a toxic asset. The man she had hitched her future to was a fraud, and his entire fortune was built on a crime now laid bare for all to see. The partnership was over. Without a word, she stood up, smoothed the front of her expensive suit, picked up her briefcase, and walked out of the room, her heels clicking a sharp, final rhythm of abandonment on the marble floor. Richard didn't even seem to notice she was gone. His gaze was fixed on Eleanor, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes that she hadn't seen in 30 years. It was the look of a man whose entire world had just been demolished. But the woman he was looking at was not the one he could manipulate with a soft word or a hollow promise. Eleanor met his gaze, her expression not of triumph or hatred, but of a calm, profound finality. She was simply seeing him for the very first time, for exactly what he was. The resolution, after that, was an avalanche. Faced with undeniable evidence of embezzlement and fraud, crimes that carried not just financial penalties, but the very real possibility of prison time, Richard's legal team folded completely. The fight was over. The negotiations were no longer about a fair division of marital assets. They were about the scale of his surrender. Mark was ruthless in his pursuit of justice for Eleanor. The final settlement was staggering. Richard was forced to relinquish not only 50% of all legitimate marital property, but the entirety of her mother's stolen inheritance. And Mark, using the ledger as his guide, had calculated 30 years of compound interest, arguing that Richard had not just stolen the principal, but the immense opportunity for growth that capital would have generated. The final sum was a fortune in its own right, a figure that dwarfed the initial, insulting offer and carved out a massive portion of Richard's carefully hidden wealth. His business empire, now exposed as being founded on a lie, began to unravel. Partners pulled out, investors launched investigations, and the authorities began to take a very keen interest in his creative accounting. The bankruptcy he had faked was quickly becoming a reality. The other woman, Victoria, vanished. Having seen the source of Richard's wealth revealed as a crime, she severed all ties, disappearing from his life as quickly and clinically as she had entered Eleanor's. Her ambition had no room for a man facing financial ruin and potential criminal charges. Richard was left alone, a king dethroned, surrounded by the ruins of a kingdom built on sand. The story ends months later, not with a return, but with a beginning. The final scene isn't in a courtroom or a lawyer's office. It isn't in the cold, sterile mansion that Eleanor once called home. Instead, it's in a charming, sunlit workshop on a bustling neighborhood street. The large front window reads, "Second Bloom Restorations." Inside, the air smells of beeswax, fresh paint, and sawdust. Eleanor is there, a light dusting of that sawdust on her cheek and in her hair. She is wearing simple overalls over a soft flannel shirt, her hands strong and capable as she carefully applies a final coat of varnish to a beautiful old rocking chair. A genuine, unforced smile plays on her lips as she talks with a young couple admiring a refinished dining table. She is not the ghost who haunted the halls of a lonely mansion, nor the broken woman who wept in a cheap motel room. She is vibrant, engaged, and utterly at peace. The workshop is modest, but it is filled with warmth, with life, with the beauty of things that were once discarded being given a new chance. It is the perfect reflection of its owner. Her victory, in the end, was not just about the money, though the financial security was a welcome foundation. It wasn't even about revenge. It was about reclamation. She had reclaimed her mother's legacy, honoring the cautious love that had reached across decades to save her. She had reclaimed her own identity, discovering that her worth was never tied to a man's name or his wealth, but was forged in her own resilience and creativity. She had paid a terrible price in pain and suffering, walking through a fire that had burned her old life to the ground. But from those ashes, she had emerged stronger, more authentic and truly free. She had built a new life, a new business, a new self, one founded not on a partnership of lies, but on the undeniable, unshakable strength of her own two hands. The bell above the workshop door chimed, a pleasant, cheerful sound that always made her look up from her work. It wasn't the jarring summons of an intercom, or the silent dread of a husband's car pulling into the driveway. It was the sound of possibility, of a new connection, of a life she controlled. She wiped her hands on a soft rag, leaving a faint smudge of oak stain on her overalls, and greeted the new customer with a smile that reached her eyes. This simple, honest interaction was more fulfilling than any of the dozens of lavish, empty parties she had once hosted. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of forgotten furniture waiting for a second chance, Eleanor was no longer defined by her relationship to a powerful man or the size of his bank account. She was defined by her skill, her vision, and her integrity. The quiet hum of the sander, the rhythmic sweep of a paintbrush, the satisfaction of a perfectly fitted joint, these were the new rhythms of her life. They were sounds of creation, not of maintenance. She wasn't just preserving a sterile image of perfection. She was building something new and beautiful from the wreckage of the old. Her journey through the fire of betrayal had burned away the illusions she had mistaken for happiness. She came to understand that the greatest poverty is not the absence of money, but the absence of self. Richard, in his relentless pursuit of wealth and status, had become hollow, a man whose entire existence was a carefully constructed lie. He had amassed a fortune but had lost his soul. Eleanor, in losing that fortune, had found hers. The pain of the past would always be a part of her story, like the grain in a piece of wood. But it no longer defined the shape of her life. It was simply a part of the history that made the finished piece stronger, more interesting, and infinitely more valuable. She had learned that a life, much like a piece of antique furniture, can be stripped down to its bare essentials, broken and discarded, and still hold the potential for a breathtaking restoration. All it takes is patience, a clear vision, and the strength to do the work. If you were moved by Eleanor's journey of resilience and justice, please show your support by liking this video. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of her story resonated with you the most? And don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications for more stories that inspire and empower. Thank you for watching.